We stand at the threshold of a decisive moment, not merely the turning of a calendar page, but an invitation to examine how we think, why we believe, and where we are truly going. Every month, every season, every measured unit of time confronts us with a question far more profound than scheduling or planning. Are we moving forward with clarity or simply drifting with momentum? A reset is not an emotional impulse. It is a deliberate recalibration. It requires us to pause long enough to recognize that the greatest obstacles we face are rarely external. They are internal frameworks, assumptions left unchallenged, beliefs inherited but never examined, patterns repeated because they feel familiar rather than true. Progress does not begin when conditions improve. It begins when perception is corrected. This is the month to realign thought with purpose, conviction with action, and knowledge with responsibility. Forward movement is not automatic. It is the result of choosing truth over comfort and discipline over delay. Time does not heal confusion. Only understanding does. If we are willing to reset our mindset honestly, intentionally, and courageously, we do not merely enter a new month. We step into a new trajectory. A reset is not about changing circumstances, but renewing the way we perceive reality and truth, because circumstances are often the least reliable indicators of where we actually stand. External conditions fluctuate constantly, shaped by forces beyond our control, but perception governs how those conditions shape us. Two people can stand in the same moment, face the same pressure, and emerge with entirely different outcomes, not because the moment was different, but because their interpretation of it was. The mind is the primary interface through which reality is processed, and if that interface is distorted, no amount of external change will produce lasting progress. We often assume that if something around us improves, finances, relationships, opportunities, clarity will follow. History repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. Clarity precedes change, not the other way around. Without a renewed way of seeing, improved circumstances merely amplify confusion. Renewing perception begins with confronting the narratives we have accepted as truth without examination. Many beliefs are not conclusions we reached, but assumptions we inherited, absorbed through repetition, culture, fear, or convenience. Over time, these assumptions harden into frameworks, and frameworks quietly dictate decisions. When a mindset is built on untested premises, progress becomes accidental at best. A reset, therefore, is an act of intellectual and spiritual honesty. It asks uncomfortable questions. Why do I think this way? What evidence supports this belief? Does this perception align with reality or merely protect me from discomfort? Truth has a way of unsettling us before it stabilizes us because it dismantles illusions we've grown accustomed to trusting. Renewal also requires recognizing that perception is not neutral. What we focus on expands, and what we ignore diminishes. A mind trained to look for threat will interpret every challenge as danger. A mind trained to look for meaning will interpret challenge as instruction. Reality itself does not change, but its implications do. This is why two identical events can produce either paralysis or momentum. Resetting the mind means reclaiming authority over focus, refusing to let past failures, disappointments, or unresolved questions dictate present interpretation. The past can inform, but it must never command. When it does, perception becomes anchored to what was rather than oriented toward what is possible. Truth renewal also involves accepting that reality operates by principles, not preferences. We live in an age that prizes feeling over fact and comfort over correction, yet reality remains stubbornly indifferent to our opinions about it. Gravity does not negotiate, time does not reverse, and consequences do not apologize. A renewed mindset aligns itself with how things actually work, not how we wish they worked. This alignment produces freedom, not restriction, because it replaces frustration with understanding. Many people are exhausted not from effort, but from resisting reality while demanding progress. Resetting perception means submitting assumptions to truth, not bending truth to suit assumptions. Another critical aspect of renewal is recognizing the difference between information and understanding. We are saturated with data, opinions, and advice, yet clarity remains scarce. Information alone does not transform perception. Interpretation does. Understanding emerges when information is organized by truth and applied with wisdom. A reset filters noise, discerns relevance, and separates what is urgent from what is essential. It acknowledges that not every voice deserves equal weight and not every thought deserves belief. Mental renewal is as much about subtraction as addition, removing distortions, distractions, and false urgency that cloud judgment. Finally, renewing perception restores responsibility. When circumstances are blamed for stagnation, agency is surrendered. A reset reclaims that agency by acknowledging that while we may not choose every event, we always choose our response. That choice begins in the mind. Forward movement becomes possible the moment perception shifts from victimhood to stewardship, from reaction to intention. This is not denial of difficulty, it is mastery over interpretation. When perception aligns with truth, clarity follows, discipline strengthens, and direction emerges. A reset of the mind is not a retreat from reality, it is a return to it, and from that return, authentic progress begins. Time is often treated as a neutral backdrop, a passive container in which life simply happens, but that assumption misses something fundamental. Time is structured, marked by rhythms, cycles, and seasons that invite discernment. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, not merely for measurement, but for meaning. A season is not defined only by what occurs within it, but by what it is meant to produce in us. When we ignore seasons, we drift. When we recognize them, we gain the opportunity to realign. A month, then, is not an arbitrary span of days. It is a checkpoint, a pause engineered into the flow of life to provoke reflection and intentional recalibration. Throughout history, seasons have been understood as moments of testing, preparation, pruning, and growth. There are times for advance and times for restraint, times for building and times for examining foundations. Treating every moment as identical dulls discernment and weakens judgment. Reflection requires boundaries, and seasons provide those boundaries. Without them, life becomes a blur of activity without direction. Alignment is not accidental. It is the product of recognizing when a season calls for reassessment rather than acceleration. Many people attempt to force progress in a season designed for correction, and they mistake resistance for failure rather than instruction. A month of reflection interrupts autopilot living. It forces the question of whether current habits are aligned with intended outcomes. Alignment is not about perfection, it is about coherence. When beliefs, actions, and goals are misaligned, effort increases while results diminish. This is why busyness so often coexists with stagnation. A reflective season exposes this dissonance. It reveals where motion has replaced meaning and activity has replaced obedience to what we already know is true. Reflection is not passive nostalgia, it is strategic evaluation. It looks backward only long enough to inform the path forward. Decisive action is the natural outcome of proper reflection. Reflection without action becomes indulgence. Action without reflection becomes recklessness. Seasons are designed to balance the two. A month invites us to identify what must end as clearly as what must begin. Endings are often resisted because they feel like loss, yet many beginnings are impossible until certain patterns are closed. Time does not move forward carrying everything with it, it sheds what is complete. Alignment requires the courage to release what no longer belongs to the next phase. This is not about regret, but readiness. Understanding seasons also reframes urgency. Not everything demands immediate response, but some things demand timely obedience. Discernment lies in knowing the difference. A reflective month sharpens that discernment by slowing reaction and strengthening insight. It teaches patience without passivity and urgency without panic. When time is respected as purposeful, decisions become cleaner and distractions lose their authority. The pressure to do everything at once gives way to the clarity of doing the right thing at the right time. Ignoring seasons leads to misinterpretation of resistance. What feels like obstruction may actually be instruction to pause, examine, and realign. Conversely, what feels like ease may not always signal approval, but momentum carried by habit. A reflective season teaches us to test momentum rather than trust it blindly. Alignment asks whether movement is sustainable, ethical, and true, not merely fast. This is how time becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Ultimately, recognizing seasons restores meaning to movement. Life ceases to feel random and begins to feel ordered, even when challenging. Reflection grounds us, alignment centers us, and decisive action propels us forward with purpose rather than impulse. A month set apart for this process becomes a hinge point, a deliberate interruption that redirects trajectory. When time is honored as intentional, progress becomes less about striving and more about responding wisely to what the season is clearly asking of us. The mind is not a passive observer of life, it is the command center from which direction is set and decisions are launched. Every outcome begins as a thought long before it becomes an action. This is why the mind is the primary battleground. What we consistently believe determines what we consistently choose, and what we choose repeatedly becomes the direction of our lives. Conflicts are rarely lost in a single dramatic moment. They are surrendered quietly through unchecked assumptions, tolerated distortions, and unchallenged fears. Long before behavior collapses, belief erodes. Belief systems function like internal maps. They tell us what is possible, what is dangerous, what is worth pursuing, and what should be avoided. When those maps are inaccurate, even sincere effort leads us in the wrong direction. A person can work tirelessly and still make no meaningful progress if the underlying beliefs guiding that effort are flawed. This is why motivation alone is insufficient. Motivation can energize action, but belief determines aim. Without examining belief systems, we may move faster while drifting further from truth. Fear is one of the most powerful weapons used in this internal conflict. Fear narrows perception, exaggerates threats, and distorts probabilities. It convinces the mind to prioritize safety over truth and comfort over growth. Once fear is accepted as a legitimate authority, it begins to dictate choices while disguising itself as wisdom. Many decisions labeled as practical are actually fear-driven compromises that slowly redefine identity. The battleground is not the situation itself, but the interpretation of it. When fear controls interpretation, direction becomes reactive rather than intentional. Another combatant in this battle is familiarity. The mind prefers what is known over what is true if truth demands change. Familiar patterns feel safe even when they are destructive. This is why people often return to habits they claim to hate. The mind defends the familiar because it reduces uncertainty. Yet growth requires uncertainty, and forward movement demands a willingness to confront the discomfort of learning something new about oneself. The battleground intensifies at the point where truth threatens routine. At that moment, the mind must choose whether to defend comfort or pursue clarity. The narratives we tell ourselves shape this battle more than we realize. Internal dialogue reinforces belief systems daily. Statements repeated internally become accepted realities, regardless of their accuracy. Over time, the mind stops questioning them. This is just how I am. This always happens to me. I can't change this are not observations. They are conclusions. Once conclusions are formed, evidence is selectively interpreted to support them. This creates a closed system where belief defends itself against correction. Winning the battle of the mind requires reopening that system and subjecting conclusions to truth. Discipline plays a critical role here, not as punishment, but as protection. A disciplined mind does not accept every thought as valid. It evaluates, tests, and filters. It recognizes that thoughts are suggestions, not commands. Without discipline, the mind becomes crowded with contradictions, anxieties, and distractions, each competing for authority. Direction becomes fragmented, and progress stalls. Discipline restores order, allowing belief to be anchored in what is true rather than what is loud or familiar. The battleground intensifies during moments of transition. Change exposes beliefs that were previously hidden by routine. When old structures are removed, what remains is what truly governs the mind. This is why transition often feels chaotic. It is not merely external change, it is internal exposure. Yet this exposure is not a threat, it is an opportunity. It reveals which beliefs are stable and which were only supported by circumstance. Forward direction depends on addressing this honestly rather than rushing to restore comfort. The battle of the mind is not won by force, but by alignment. When belief aligns with truth, resistance diminishes. Decisions become clearer, courage strengthens, and direction stabilizes. The mind ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a navigation system. But this transformation is intentional. It requires vigilance, humility, and a commitment to examine what we believe before we act on it. Direction and destiny are not determined by external opposition as much as internal agreement. When the mind is renewed, the path forward is no longer obscured, it is revealed. Forward movement rarely begins with acquiring something new. it almost always begins with releasing something old. Yet this is the step most resisted because letting go forces confrontation. Old narratives, habits, and fears do not persist because they are useful, but because they are familiar. They provide identity, explanation, and a strange sense of control. Even pain can become predictable, and predictability feels safer than uncertainty. To move forward, these internal structures must be challenged, not gently ignored. Growth demands a willingness to dismantle what once protected us but now restricts us. Old narratives are stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what life allows, and what outcomes are realistic. Many of these narratives were formed during moments of failure, disappointment, or trauma. At the time, they offered meaning and helped us cope. Over time, however, they quietly harden into limits. What began as an explanation becomes a definition. "This is why it happened" turns into "this is who I am." When identity is shaped by past wounds, the future is forced to orbit old conclusions. Forward movement becomes impossible without rewriting the story, and rewriting requires courage because it means admitting that the narrative, though once necessary, is no longer true. Habits function as the physical expression of these narratives. Every repeated action reinforces a belief, and every belief seeks expression through action. Habits are efficient, they conserve mental energy. That efficiency, however, comes at a cost. Habits bypass reflection. When habits are healthy, this is strength. When they are rooted in fear, avoidance, or self-protection, they quietly sabotage progress. Breaking a habit feels unnatural because it interrupts automatic behavior. The discomfort we experience is not failure, it is awareness returning. Forward movement requires staying present long enough to choose differently rather than defaulting to what feels familiar. Fear is often the final guardian of stagnation. It disguises itself as logic, timing, or caution. It argues convincingly that now is not the right moment, that conditions are not ideal, that risks are too high. Yet fear rarely asks whether staying the same carries its own risk. Over time, fear reframes inaction as wisdom and delay as preparation. The cost is subtle but severe. Opportunities pass quietly, potential remains unused, and regret accumulates without drama. Confronting fear does not mean eliminating it, it means refusing to grant it authority. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that truth deserves obedience even when fear objects. Releasing old patterns also requires grieving what they provided. Even destructive habits often served a purpose. They numbed pain, offered distraction, or created a sense of control. Letting go can feel like loss because it is. There is a death involved, the death of an old identity, an old explanation, an old coping mechanism. Avoiding this grief keeps people trapped in cycles they claim to hate. Forward movement honors the past without allowing it to govern the future. It acknowledges what was gained without surrendering what is now possible. Another barrier to release is the desire for certainty. Old patterns are predictable, new paths are not. The mind demands guarantees before it will cooperate, but life offers none. Waiting for certainty is another form of delay disguised as responsibility. Movement clarifies what thought cannot. Many answers only appear after obedience, not before it. Forward motion creates feedback, insight, and adjustment. Standing still in pursuit of perfect clarity often produces the opposite. Confusion deepens, confidence erodes, and fear gains ground. Confrontation, then, is not aggression, it is honesty. It is the willingness to look at one's own patterns without justification or condemnation. It asks not, "Why am I like this?" but "Is this still true?" That question alone loosens the grip of the past. Release becomes possible when we recognize that identity is not fixed by history, but shaped by choice. The moment we stop defending old narratives, they begin to lose authority. Moving forward is an act of alignment, not force. It happens when beliefs, actions, and truth converge. Old habits fall away not because they are attacked, but because they are outgrown. Fear weakens not because it is silenced, but because it is exposed. When we confront what no longer serves us, we do not become reckless, we become free. Forward movement begins the moment we decide that who we are becoming matters more than who we have been. Lasting transformation is rarely sustained by emotion alone. Motivation can ignite action, but it cannot maintain direction. Emotions rise and fall, influenced by energy, environment, affirmation, and circumstance. Truth, however, remains steady regardless of how it is received. This is why truth, not motivation, is the engine of genuine change. Motivation asks, how do I feel about this today? Truth asks, what is real and what does it require of me? When transformation depends on feeling inspired, progress becomes inconsistent. When it depends on truth, progress becomes resilient. Motivation is reactive by nature. It responds to external stimulation, words that excite, stories that inspire, moments that stir desire. These inputs are not harmful, but they are temporary. Once the stimulus fades, so does the energy it produced. This creates cycles of enthusiasm followed by discouragement, commitment followed by abandonment. Many people mistake this pattern for personal failure, when in reality it is structural weakness. They built change on emotion rather than understanding. Truth builds differently. It anchors action to conviction rather than excitement. Conviction does not require constant reinforcement because it is rooted in reality, not mood. Truth also confronts us, which is why it is often resisted. Motivation comforts, truth corrects. Motivation tells us we can do anything. Truth tells us what must be done. This distinction matters. Comfort can coexist with stagnation, but correction produces growth. Transformation begins when we allow truth to challenge assumptions, expose inconsistencies, and demand alignment. This process is rarely pleasant, but it is effective. Truth does not negotiate with preference. It reveals consequences clearly and without apology. When embraced, it replaces confusion with clarity and impulse with intention. Another reason truth sustains change is that it integrates responsibility. Motivation often externalizes responsibility. If the feeling fades, the failure feels justified. Truth internalizes responsibility by making us accountable to what we know. Once truth is understood, ignoring it becomes a choice rather than an accident. This accountability strengthens discipline. Discipline rooted in truth is not oppressive, it is purposeful. It frees us from the exhausting need to constantly feel ready before acting. Action becomes an expression of alignment, not emotional readiness. Truth also simplifies decision-making. When values and principles are clear, options narrow naturally. Confusion thrives where truth is vague. Many people feel overwhelmed not because they have too many responsibilities, but because they have not decided what matters most. Truth orders priorities. It clarifies what deserves effort and what does not. This clarity reduces friction and fatigue. Energy is conserved because it is no longer wasted on internal debate. Motivation fluctuates, but truth stabilizes focus. Sustainable transformation also requires endurance, and endurance is incompatible with emotional dependence. There will be days when progress feels invisible, effort feels wasted, and enthusiasm feels absent. Motivation cannot carry us through those moments, but truth can. Truth reminds us why the path was chosen in the first place. It reconnects action to meaning rather than outcome. This is critical because results often lag behind obedience. Those who rely on motivation quit when results delay. Those who rely on truth persist because understanding precedes evidence. Truth also guards against deception, especially self-deception. Motivation can convince us we are changing simply because we feel engaged. Truth asks harder questions. Has behavior changed? Has thinking shifted? Are patterns different? It measures transformation by fruit, not feeling. This protects us from confusing activity with progress. It replaces performance with substance. When truth governs transformation, integrity increases because actions align with beliefs rather than impressions. Finally, truth sustains transformation because it connects change to identity rather than outcomes. Motivation is goal-oriented, truth is identity-oriented. Goals can be reached and forgotten, but identity shapes ongoing behavior. When truth reshapes how we see ourselves and the world, change becomes self-reinforcing. We act differently not to achieve something, but because we understand something. This understanding recalibrates desire itself. What once required effort becomes natural, and what once felt tempting loses appeal. In the end, motivation may start the journey, but it cannot finish it. Only truth carries us through resistance, fatigue, delay, and doubt. Transformation that lasts is not fueled by how strongly we feel, but by how clearly we see. When truth becomes the engine, progress no longer depends on inspiration. It depends on alignment, and alignment, once established, moves us forward even when emotions fall silent. A renewed mindset does not emerge spontaneously. It is cultivated through intention, discipline, and sustained reflection. Without structure, even the clearest insights erode over time. Renewal is not a single decision, but a practiced posture. It is the daily commitment to guard what enters the mind, to examine what remains there, and to act in accordance with what is true rather than what is convenient. Discipline is often misunderstood as restriction, but in reality, it is preservation. It protects clarity from erosion and purpose from distraction. Intentionality is the starting point. A renewed mindset begins when one decides that thoughts will no longer be left to chance. The mind absorbs whatever it is repeatedly exposed to, whether chosen or not. Without intention, it defaults to noise, urgency, and familiarity. Intentional reflection interrupts this process. It creates space to ask whether current thoughts are producing the life we intend to live. Reflection is not passive contemplation, it is active evaluation. It tests assumptions, measures outcomes, and identifies inconsistencies between belief and behavior. Discipline then sustains what reflection reveals. Insight without discipline becomes frustration. Discipline applies understanding consistently, especially when motivation is absent. It establishes rhythms that reinforce clarity, regular times of silence, focused study, deliberate limitation of distractions. These practices may appear ordinary, but their cumulative effect is profound. Over time, they train the mind to resist impulsive reaction and to default toward wisdom. Discipline does not eliminate struggle, but it reduces chaos. It narrows the gap between knowing and doing. Obedience to revealed principles is the hinge on which renewal turns. Knowing what is true is insufficient if it is not acted upon. Obedience is often delayed under the assumption that greater clarity is needed. In reality, clarity often follows obedience. Many principles are not fully understood until they are practiced. Obedience refines understanding through experience. It moves truth from abstraction into reality. This is why renewal accelerates when action aligns quickly with insight, even when understanding feels incomplete. Reflection must also be ongoing. The mind is not static, it is shaped continuously by experience. Without regular recalibration, old patterns reassert themselves. Reflection acts as maintenance. It identifies drift early before it becomes distance. This process requires humility, because it admits that renewal is never finished. The moment we assume the mind no longer needs guarding is the moment distortion begins. Reflection keeps awareness sharp and dependence honest. A renewed mindset also requires restraint. Not every thought deserves attention, and not every opportunity deserves pursuit. Discipline includes the ability to say no to inputs that clutter, commitments that dilute, and conversations that erode clarity. Restraint is not withdrawal from life. It is strategic engagement. It preserves energy for what matters most. Many people lose renewal not through rebellion, but through overextension. They exhaust clarity by scattering focus. Discipline restores coherence by enforcing boundaries. Obedience further transforms desire. Initially, discipline may feel forced because it contradicts habit. Over time, obedience reshapes appetite. What once required effort becomes natural, and what once felt normal begins to feel misaligned. This shift signals true renewal. The mind is no longer merely resisting old patterns, it is preferring new ones. This is not suppression, but transformation. Desire follows understanding when understanding is consistently acted upon. Renewal also deepens responsibility. As clarity increases, excuses lose credibility. A renewed mind recognizes that ignorance is no longer the issue. Alignment is. This can feel weighty, but it is also liberating. Responsibility clarifies choice. It replaces confusion with ownership. Forward movement becomes a matter of faithfulness rather than intensity. Small, consistent acts of obedience compound into significant change. Ultimately, a renewed mindset is sustained not by constant inspiration, but by faithful practice. Discipline, reflection, and obedience form a cycle that reinforces itself. Reflection reveals truth, discipline preserves it, and obedience activates it. Together, they create momentum that does not depend on circumstance. Renewal becomes a way of life rather than a moment of insight. When the mind is guarded intentionally and aligned consistently, movement forward is no longer forced. It becomes the natural outcome of living in accordance with what is known to be true. Moving forward is rarely delayed by a lack of information. It is delayed by a reluctance to act on what is already known. Most people possess far more understanding than they are willing to obey. Insight accumulates, notes are taken, ideas are discussed. Yet momentum remains stalled because knowledge has not been converted into action. Growth does not require new revelation as much as it requires response. The distance between where we are and where we want to be is often measured not in learning, but in courage. Courage is not bravado or impulse. It is the quiet resolve to act in alignment with truth despite uncertainty, discomfort, or fear of outcome. Acting on what we already know exposes us to risk, of failure, of criticism, of change. Yet inaction carries its own risks, though they are less visible. Stagnation erodes confidence slowly. Delay normalizes compromise. Over time, what was once a decision becomes an identity. Forward movement demands courage because it interrupts this drift and forces choice. One of the greatest illusions is the belief that readiness precedes action. We wait to feel confident, prepared, or certain before moving. In reality, confidence is often the result of obedience, not the prerequisite. Movement produces clarity that contemplation cannot. Many answers are revealed only after the first step is taken. This is why acting on what is known feels uncomfortable. It requires stepping into partial understanding. Courage accepts incomplete clarity in exchange for progress. Another barrier to action is the desire for validation. Acting on truth can isolate, especially when it contradicts consensus or expectation. Waiting for approval delays obedience and transfers authority to external voices. Courage reclaims that authority. It recognizes that responsibility cannot be outsourced. While counsel is valuable, obedience is personal. Forward movement often begins quietly, without applause, and sometimes in direct opposition to familiar support systems. This does not make it reckless, it makes it resolute. Fear also disguises itself as wisdom by exaggerating potential consequences. It demands guarantees that life cannot provide. Courage does not deny risk, it weighs it honestly. It recognizes that avoiding risk altogether guarantees stagnation. Every meaningful advance requires exposure. Growth always involves leaving something behind: certainty, reputation, control. Courage chooses movement over preservation. It understands that safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of alignment. Acting on what we know also requires humility. Knowledge without action breeds arrogance. We begin to confuse understanding with maturity. Humility restores balance by acknowledging that truth is validated through obedience, not discussion. Forward movement is not about proving insight, but practicing it. This practice refines understanding, exposing flaws, and deepening wisdom. Those willing to act learn faster than those who merely analyze. Courage also breaks the cycle of endless preparation. Preparation is valuable, but it can become a hiding place. At some point, preparation must give way to execution. Acting on what is known reveals what preparation could not. It provides feedback, correction, and refinement. Movement transforms abstract principles into lived experience. Without action, knowledge remains theoretical and detached from reality. The cost of delayed obedience is cumulative. Each postponed action strengthens resistance and weakens resolve. Over time, the will becomes conditioned to delay and courage erodes. Acting now, even imperfectly, preserves momentum. Forward movement is not about flawless execution, but faithful response. Adjustments can be made in motion. Stagnation offers no such flexibility. Ultimately, courage aligns belief with behavior. It closes the gap between conviction and conduct. This alignment produces integrity, which in turn produces strength. Forward movement becomes sustainable because it is grounded in consistency rather than impulse. Acting on what we already know does not guarantee immediate success, but it guarantees growth. And growth, once initiated, creates its own momentum. The month to move forward is not marked by new information, but by decisive obedience. Courage transforms knowledge into direction. When we act on what is already clear, confusion diminishes, confidence increases, and the path ahead becomes visible one step at a time. Forward movement begins not when we know more, but when we do more with what we already know.